Good afternoon, everybody. Hi, welcome to the session on Chainsets and promoting your changes between environments. My name is Rohit Mehta, and I'm a product manager on the App Cloud team. Today, I'll be going over the basics of making changes, pushing them to production, using Chainsets and some best practices around that. Before we can get started, just a slide on safe harbor, right? This slide just says anything that's spoken in this session could be forward-looking and should not bias your decision towards buying your products. Decisions should be made based on generally available products today. All right, so our agenda will be a little bit on ALM. I don't think you can do justice without speaking a little bit about ALM, which is application lifecycle management, going over sandboxes, Chainsets, best practices, pitfalls, and migration, and then some time for Q&A. All right, so what is ALM? ALM stands for Application Lifecycle Management. It is the process of managing an app's design all the way to the release step, right? You have a product manager or a business owner who comes up with product specifications. Those product specifications are put together in some form of a design doc, handed over to a development team who builds these changes, and then hands it over to a testing team. The testing team verifies that none of these changes are going to do any ill effect in production. And then finally, there's some team, a release management team or a release manager who is responsible for deploying those changes into production. Now, depending on your org and the size of your development teams, this structure might vary a little bit. You could have a single developer also be the QA person. That person could also be doing some of the administrative duties, could also be doing some of the pushing to production, or you could have a standalone team of developers, right? But the point is, you have a process in place that is well understood, well defined, and it can be reused for major enhancement, major products, major app changes, minor enhancements, bug fixes, and whatnot. It's a wash, rinse, repeat mantra, right? You do this iteratively over and over again, and everyone understands what you're doing, what the process is. All right, so with that in mind, let's do a little demo. This talk is going to be very demo-friendly. So how many of you guys went to the political rally last night at the Cloud Palace? Oh, okay, great. So, after I got out of there, I thought about, I want to demo something. And I had this warehouse app, which is basically on every Trailhead demo and all that. So I said, okay, let's switch it up a little bit. Let's create an app that tracks bands and band members. Right? It's like an IMDb for musicians, for bands. So let's get started with that. Let's do a little small app. We'll just create a few objects and fields, nothing too serious. All right, so let me first go to my production environment. This is my production environment. This is what the PM team uses. We basically have all our data, all our business data, all the things that we talk about, product decisions, everything is in this org, right? So let me go create. Can you guys see this in the back? Fine. Okay. All right. All right. So let's go to objects, and let's create a new custom object called band. Okay, before I hit save, do you think I'm missing something out here? Anyone? Description? Oh yeah, that's great. Something about the URL maybe? Do you guys see that it says NA out there? Never make changes in a production environment. So that's the first step, first rule of developing something. Never make changes in a production environment, right? So let me switch back to my demo here, or to my slides here. and keep going on with. That's what the most interesting man thinks, right? I don't always test my code, but when I do it in production. Now, I don't know about you guys. I know he's the most interesting man, but you definitely don't want to be the most infamous man in your organization, right? You don't want to be known to be the person who makes a change into production and breaks things. And then they all come down hunting you and take you off your lunch break and say, oh, go fix it, right? So how do you make changes then? Well, you have these standalone environments called sandbox environments. These are standalone. They are isolated from production. And anything that you do in the bounds of a sandbox environment does not get propagated to production unless you choose to do so. You build in these environments, you test it there, you integrate it with your existing data and with all your third-party solutions, and then only when you're comfortable with these changes do you push it to production. You have 4 different types, 2 of which are developer-focused, developer and developer pro. So they carry over your metadata, and that's where you make your changes. The other 2 sandboxes have a little bit of data in them, and they're mainly used for testing, training, and then final validation and pushing to production. So now that you have sandboxes, right, how do you finally move these changes to production? There are several different tools, one of which is the Chainsets tool. This is what we're here for. Chainsets are a point-and-click development tool meant for moving changes from one org to the other. It involves a few different steps. You first set up the connection between the 2 orgs, so you have to validate it on both the source and the target side. That's the deployment connection. You package up you create your changes in your sandbox environment. You package them up in what we call a chainset, and you deploy it. When you upload it, sorry. When you upload it, it appears on your target org as one of the incoming chainsets. This is where you can choose to validate those changes, run tests, and then deploy it right away or schedule a deployment so that it can propagate into your environment and into your org as and when needed. This is useful because in a production setting, you don't want to make changes during the regular business activities. You want to do this during off-peak hours, perhaps, such as nights or weekends. So that's a very useful feature. Also, chainsets are a feature which is in the UI. It's all point and click. It's great for small teams and small projects, but as these projects scale out, there's need for more automation and some other more sophisticated tools. I will go over some of those tools. I'll just briefly mention them towards the end of the demo. All right, so let's get back to our demo and do it the right way. What are we going to do this time? We'll first create a sandbox. We'll go to the sandbox, make changes in the sandbox. We'll set up the deployment settings between the 2 orgs, between our production and the sandbox. We'll package it up, create a chain set, and then upload that chain set on the sandbox. We'll finally see that on the production side, deploy it, and voila, we'll see it in production. All right. So on your production org, if you go to setup and you click on sandbox, that's where you have all your environments available for use. I have a couple sandboxes here ready for the demo, but I'll just kick off one here. So I'll call this sandbox 3, and I'll create a dev sandbox. And boom, you just requested a sandbox. This is an async process. It takes a little bit of time. Should be ready quite soon for a smallish sandbox. All right, but let's go into one of our existing sandboxes, sandbox 2. Let me type in my password. How do you guys spell password? Well, there you go. Cool. So now that we are here, let's go into setup. Objects. So we'll start off with just the basics. We'll create a band and a band member. Right? So let's create a band. Bands. Use a group. Never forget the description. That's best practice. Save. We'll create another one called band members. Band member. People belonging to the group. Let's create a few fields here. So we know that band members belong to bands. Let's create a master detail relationship on the band member to a band. I'll tell you why I'm doing this here. There's a reason why I've picked this relationship type, and it'll be more obvious down this demo. I don't want to do any of these settings. Save. Awesome. So we have two objects, and the band member has a master in band. All right, let's make sure our deployment settings look good. So on the Sandbox side, deployment settings, this should automatically pop up as it's connected to a production environment, because the Sandbox was created from the production environment. However, you still have to go to the production org and authenticate that this Sandbox is allowed to send Chainsets. So on the Sandbox org, let's go to deployment settings. And you will see here that Sandbox 2 has not yet been set up to send its changes. So let's go to edit, allow inbound chainsets, and that's it. That's as easy as it can get. We've set up the connection between the Sandbox and your production org, and you're ready to go with your chainsets. All right, so on the Sandbox side, let's go to outbound chainsets, and let's create a chainset that has the two objects. Right, so let's create one. Let's call this band objects. Save. Now down below here on the chainsets component section is where you add the different objects, fields, apps, tabs, page layouts, all those things into your chainset. As you can see, I'm going to select a custom object that I just created, and I'm going to select the band member. I want to select the band just for a specific reason. I'll add to chainset. And then there's this little button here which says View Add Dependencies. Now remember I said that there was this special relationship between band and band member about a master detail relationship. Hopefully this button will remind you that, hey, if you're trying to add band member, more than likely you need the band, because the band member by itself means nothing. So there you see the band object. We also see the fields that were created as part of those objects, the page layout. And so it's a very easy way to make sure that you're not skipping out any objects that needed to be as part of those chainsets. Obviously, this is not foolproof. You can imagine other apps and other designs where some of these relationships aren't enforced, but you know from your design that these objects should go together. So this tool is a utility, but it's not foolproof. You still have to figure out, and you still have to make sure that all those changes are pulled in. So add to chainset. And we should be ready to upload it. So in a few minutes, let me select production. So this is an async process. You submit a chainset upload request, it gets handled, and then the chainset is uploaded and ready at the production org. I'll switch over to the production org for now, and we'll see some of the chainsets that I'd already kept ready in case this upload was not fast enough. Oh, I already see the band objects, but I also have these other that I created from Sandbox 1. They look just the same as the one that we just created, right? So let's look at one of them, the first cut. The first cut has the band member, the band layout, band member layout object, and the band field. Validating this is as simple as just clicking on validate and being able to run tests. Now, why is this important? This is important because you want to make sure you're not breaking anything in production before you deploy, or anything in the org that's your target org. You can run no tests by default, or you can run tests that are specific to what you've written. You can choose select specified test, or you can just choose to run all tests. For the changes such as custom objects and fields, there aren't really a lot of tests that can be run. But for Apex and Visualforce and Lightning, you would have to select one of these options. So I'm going to skip the validate here. And finally, deploy. So this deployment has started. It'll give me a notification when it's completed. And when it does, it will appear in your list of chainsets as one of those that has completed deployment. And you should be able to, there you go, deploy chainsets. You should be able to go and verify that those objects appear in your custom objects. Pretty simple, right? So what about profiles and permission sets? Profiles and permission sets work a little differently, right? They're standalone. The profiles and permissions cannot be moved standalone. They have to be assigned. They have to move along with the rest of the objects and fields that are being sent along as part of the chainset. This might seem counterintuitive, but it's actually a feature. It's so that we don't, if a profile is used for a whole lot of different objects, we want to make sure that you know which objects you're referring to when you're passing these profiles along in your chainset. They also don't get assigned automatically in your production org. So even if you've assigned them to users in your sandbox org, they will not just trigger through in your production org. You still have to go and manually assign users these permission sets. And good examples of deploying profiles and permission sets, they can be used to define CRUD operations on the different objects and fields, and also on other things such as layouts. So let's do a quick demo of that as well. Out here, I will create a permission set. Just a simple band permission, band access. And then just select the different fields and objects that I want included in this permission set for our demo. Band members and bands. Right now you can see there's no access, but we'll enable some CRUD operations here. And let's switch around to band members. Enable those as well. And then go back to our outbound chainsets. Like I said, if you select, permission set, and then just select the permission set by itself, it will not propagate correctly because you don't have the associated objects attached to that permission set as part of that chain set. So I'm going to go skip some of these steps here and then just show you what this looks like. Right? So inbound chain sets. I have two chain sets here. One which has just the permission set, band access, and one which has the band access along with the objects that we just deployed, which helps you. It's called junction interface. It helps you figure out which objects that permission set is associated with. So in this case, we have the permission set, band access along with the other objects. And in the first case, we don't have, we just have the permission set by itself. So deploy this. Should take just a moment. If you go to permission sets and you see band access, you will realize that band members and bands didn't get selected here because I deployed a chain set that had only the permission set, not the associated objects. So let's deploy the other chain set. Permission set 2. Again, it might sound counterintuitive, but it is meant to be so that you are aware of all the changes that you're making and that you don't miss out on any of these changes. Some of these things, if done wrong, can have negative consequences, and that's not good either. So go back to permission sets, band access, and you should see the CRUD operations that we defined in our permission set. So that was a quick overview of working with profiles and permission sets with Chainsets. So common pitfalls, right? We saw how just the missing up of, missing a single dependency or not attaching the right objects with the permission sets in the chain set can just not do the right thing, right? So there are certain pitfalls. One of them is missing dependencies, right? You don't want to be able, your chain sets will fail if you try to push changes that are not including all the relevant dependencies. Also, if your tests fail the 75% code coverage, that is the minimum requirement for any deployment to happen. If that fails, your chain set won't get deployed. The state of the target org, right? You can imagine that I could have had several sandboxes connected to this production org and multiple developers working in parallel, all pushing the changes to the production org. It is important to have an environment where you can integrate these changes prior to going to production. You don't want to have multiple paths to production. You just want to have single path. If you have, you could have had another developer here creating another object on this band app and having a different set of fields or a different set of objects that didn't go well with my band and my band member object. In that case, that deployment would not have the right impact in production. So knowing the state of your target org is important. Poor planning. Again, this goes back to the whole ALM process. It's important to have good communication, good project plan in place so that all the stakeholders are aware of this. There has to be a good strategy, such as who is creating the changes, who is deploying these changes, when is this person deploying this change, what happens if this deployment fails, what happens if the deployment does something wrong in production, how do you roll back a deployment, right? How do you validate a deployment once it's done in production? All those things are very important. You don't want to come in on a Monday morning and your users logging into their production org and seeing all kinds of changes that they're not aware of. It does not matter how cool your app is if they're taken by surprise. So communication is key. Having a project plan is also very important. You will see results such as suboptimal product, low user engagement, lower ROI, if some of these things are not put in place. So some of the best practices, right? These best practices have been taken up over the years based on our interaction with customers and some of the log line errors that we see when deployments fail, right? First of all, know which environment to make your changes in, right? Sandbox environment is a standalone environment which is meant for making these changes. There are different sandboxes, know which one to use. Have a clear path to production. You don't want to have conflicting changes happening at the production level. It's better to fail early on in development, and in testing than in production. Refresh after every release. This is to make sure that your org and the state of the org in which all developers are working is consistent. Consistency is key while developing an app. You don't want to be working with different versions of the app. You want to be working with the same version as it appears in production. So refreshing at a regular time frame is key. Also know what kind of changes you need to make in your environment after a refresh is done. You don't want to be taken off guard because you didn't set up some test data or certain profiles and permissions. Governance. Like I said earlier, different environments are treated differently, and each environment has a stakeholder and an owner. Ideally, the developer environment has access from only developers and QA testers. You don't want training and UAT happening in this environment. on the flip side, for a full sandbox, you don't want developers going there and making changes. You want only the key people, such as the release manager and your UAT team, touching that environment. Release processes. Always know and have a plan for how you want to push changes within your org, right? You can have different kinds of changes that are happening. Patch and bug fixes, minor release versions, major release versions, changes that are happening within Salesforce as well, with our releases. Always know what the release process is and sync up with that. Have a documented plan. Everyone should know when a release is happening. There should be hopefully a cadence to this. A weekly, say a Thursday or a Friday where check-ins are meant to be done by that day, and validations every Monday, and releases every Tuesday, or whatever your business needs are. But having some consistent approach makes it much easier for everyone to work harmoniously. Also understand Salesforce releases, right? We at Salesforce push changes 3 times a year. You have things like the preview window when you refresh your sandboxes. You don't want to be working on a version of your developer sandbox that is not the same as your production sandbox, because deployments can fail, right? You want to be working at the same level, at the same version as your production org. Follow trust calendar, participate in the preview window. Also know when to deploy. There's some teams that like to deploy as often as every day. And then there's some teams that like to hold off on a bi-weekly basis. Both approaches work okay. It depends on the amount of risk that the team is willing to take and the end users and their appetite for accepting changes. You don't want to be pushing out app changes, major app changes every day or every week, because that will just catch your end users by surprise. But if you have a cadence where deployments, even if they cause any issues, they're minor, that will greatly help your business use case. And then finally, the end migration tool. The reason I mentioned this in the Chainsets setting is because as teams become more mature, as projects get bigger, as teams get larger, as more and more people have their hands on in this developer experience, there is greater need for automation, right? Chainsets, again, are a point-and-click tool. It's super easy to use it, but it doesn't really scale out well. The only way to scale it out is to have some things like version control, continuous delivery, and that's where the end migration tool works better. Both these tools are built on the same underlying metadata API. So in some ways, they work just the same, except one is Java end-based and one is something that's available to the UI. So the Java end-based tool, great for integration, great for command line access, and awesome for multiple teams and projects. So that's all I had today, just to give you guys an overview of how Chainsets work. I'll open the floor for questions at this point. Yes?
Can you delete fields using Chainsets?
Good question. Can you make deletions? No. So that is one of the restrictions of Chainsets. Destructive changes cannot be made via Chainsets. Nor can you move user data. So you cannot move records via Chainsets. Those are the two primary restrictions. For that, you have to use other APIs, such as Metadata API and data APIs for data. Yep. Sorry, I couldn't hear you.
Okay. When you're creating a managed package and you have to select the changes that you're making for that package, is this, and then it goes to a new release number, is this something that you might?
No, so managed packages. Yeah, so managed packages are a different way of deploying apps. It obscures what is available for the end user to see, versus Chainsets are just changing your changes where the customer where the target org can see those changes. So it's a different deployment scheme.
Yeah.
Managed packages work great for ISVs and stuff like that.
Okay.
Yeah.
Similar question to the deletion. So if I deleted a field in production and I used an old sandbox that had that field and I pushed that into production as a change set, would it recreate that deleted field?
Yeah, good question. So what happens, so yes, it will. It will recreate that field, and that's why it's important to have the latest version of production. Same thing with just two different sandboxes and conflicting changes being made there, right? Someone could have created a band member object with a lookup relationship, or just a text relationship with the band, right? And that would have been conflicting with the change that I made with the master detail. That would conflict, and it would cause all kinds of inconsistent behavior. So it's important to have the right version. We recommend people using version control system for that matter, so that everything is integrated through the version control system.
So anytime there's a change or a new permission set, you also have to combine it with the objects that that permission set is touching? Is that correct?
To affect the permissions on that object, yes. Yeah, so if I was using the same band access with a different set of objects, I wouldn't necessarily have to include band because the changes that were needed on the band object have already been taken place. Okay.
So what are the best practices for reverting changes made via change sets?
Yeah, that's another good question. So ideally, customers use some form of versioning, be it in a third-party tool, such as there's one called Artifactory that keeps a snapshot of your what do you call an artifact. So you create an artifact out of whatever you're deploying to production. And so that has a version associated with it. So at any time your change set is doing something that's not correct, you can revert because you've tagged versions. Within Salesforce, we don't have a way to tag versions. This is something we're trying to delegate to a version control system. So if you go and check out some of the other Salesforce developer experience talks, you'll see how the version control system is becoming the heart of the entire flow and process. And so that is what's being used to do things such as revert. In the future, we might have utilities that make it easier, but as of today, we don't have a quick undo button.
To kind of tie into that, do you have a suggested or a best practice for naming conventions of change sets?
So your change sets should hopefully have the name of your app, and then have some version numbers that you have created for internally within your teams. Typically, version numbers are major, minor, and then patches. So it's something like 1.0.0, and that's how you track it. So change sets could be renamed or could be named to reflect the app and then the version number. And then the description could include things such as what are the fields that have changed, or what are the layouts that have changed, or the permissions for that matter. Yeah. Great, no more questions. Well, thank you for joining me today. Hopefully you'll have something to take away from here. And there are more resources on Trailhead and on the Salesforce docs. So do refer to those if needed. Thank you.